a PhD in medieval and early modern Spanish studies, also from King's. She's previously taught undergraduate courses in medieval Spanish literature at King's, and in 2014 to 15 was a lecturer in medieval Spanish literature at Queen Mary's, where she also ran the Medieval Hispanic Research Seminar.
Thank you very much, and thank you first of all to Migdad and you all for being here. It's a great pleasure to speak for you and discuss this work with you tonight. I'm a colleague of Abdul Karim Vakil, who's spoken here previously, and Yuval Evry, and they both had very positive things to say about the experience, so I'm really, really pleased to be here. So a little bit before we start about who I am, what I do, and how I got here, in other words, studying an Arabic text. Well, because I'm a postdoctoral researcher, as Migdad said, at King's College London, and I research and teach literature on medieval and early modern Spain, roughly between the 13th and the 17th centuries. So you might be wondering, well, how has that led me to studying Kalila wa-Dimna? How has this led me to an Arabic text and its translations? And to explain this, I have to briefly mention the history of Spain. Because Spain, as we know it today, is a relatively modern construct, and I use that word deliberately. The Iberian Peninsula in the Middle Ages was a fractious and fragmented land of fluid borders and shifting boundaries comprised of different political, cultural and religious groups. And for over 700 years, parts of the peninsula known as Al-Andalus were Muslim-ruled lands after the invasion of an Arab Berber army from North Africa in 711, and until 1492, when the last kingdom of Granada was defeated by the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabel. In the 11th century, however, much of the peninsula, much of Al-Andalus stretched across nearly the entirety of the peninsula. And between the 11th and 13th centuries, Iberia was part of two North African caliphates, that of the Almoravids, who invaded in the 11th century, and that of the Almohads, who displaced them in the 12th century. This meant essentially that the peninsula had political as well as religious and cultural connections to North and Sub-Saharan Africa and to the wider Islamic world and beyond to China and India. Got a map here of the extent of Islamic lands pre-1500. So medieval Iberia was therefore a contact zone, what a scholar called Mary Louise Pratt defines as a space where cultures meet, clash, and grapple with each other. It was a land shared by three faiths, by people of three faiths, by Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, and by a variety of languages and cultural traditions. And although these communities often lived separately in their own areas of a town or in different parts of a kingdom, many of them shared languages and cultures, literature, and ways of living. Now, this coexistence wasn't wholly or always utopic or harmonious. There were frequently tensions, intolerance, and violence. But Iberia's situation as a crossroads between East and West facilitated exchange and interaction. The movement of people, material goods such as spices, books, and textiles, ideas and concepts, and social practices and beliefs. The impact of this can be seen in the languages of Spain and Portuguese, and we see here that in various areas such as civic and urban life, or the military, agriculture and food, and the sciences, the influence of the Arab and Berber peoples and of Islam can be found in the languages of modern Portuguese and Spanish. It can also be seen, of course, and perhaps most famously, in the architecture of the country. And the bottom left, the images on the bottom left represent variously the Alhambra, the Alcázar in Seville, and the Córdoba Mezquita. And on the top right, these are a particular style of architecture called mudéjar and neo-mudéjar, which is directly inspired by the architecture of Al-Andalus. So in other words, the peninsula's mix of religions, languages and societies created a culturally and intellectually rich and productive environment. And medieval Iberia was one of the key centres of learning, scholarship and culture. Without this particular history in this context, Spain and indeed Europe wouldn't be the places that we know them today. All this is by way of introduction to say that what I do as a scholar of medieval and early modern Spain is investigate these interactions, these intersections and these journeys, the formation of identity, community and nations, and the movement of culture across time and space, and the transformations of these cultures and these forms, practices and beliefs. And these issues, and of course many more, are exemplified in the history of the book that I'll be talking about tonight, so Kalila and Dimna. And I'm sure some of you here will be familiar already with the work, and I look forward to hearing from you. But if for those of you that aren't, a little bit about the text. It was a book of advice intended for princes, belongs to a genre of adab literature, so the works that were devised to impart advice to rulers and high-ranking administrators, which were abundant in Arabic, Persian, and Turkish. It's a didactic work, but its didacticism isn't linked to any one religious doctrine. And so it explores a secular human, it explores secular human values, and the sorts of vices and virtues that it discusses are done so not in the context of a life after death, but rather in relation to human experience and the interactions in a social context. So this is very much about human society, political life. It teaches worldly wisdom as well as morals, practical lessons about life and government, the need for shrewdness, for prudence, justice, temperance and fortitude. In other words, how to navigate society, how to read others and interpret their actions. And structurally and formally, it belongs to a genre known as framed narratives. So it contains a series of stories within stories within stories that are framed by an overarching narrative of a discussion between a king and his advisor. And in the context of Kalila and Dimna, the king asks a series of questions and he poses problems, and the minister replies with exemplary tales that provide guidance and resolution. And often these exemplary tales are interlaced with more exemplary tales, so it's sort of like a literary Russian doll, that the further you go in, the more complex it can get. The majority of characters in the tales are animals, and this was an ancient technique found in many cultures, used for thinking about the nature of truth and the way that the world is structured. And in the work, there are parallel but intersecting worlds of men and animals, which have similar systems of hierarchy, rules, and principles of government. And the book uses these animals to explore and expose aspects of the human condition, mankind's frailties, strengths, the battles for survival, the consequences of jealousy and pride, trust and deceit, friendship and enmity. These are all essential elements of human experience regardless of time or place. And these animals speak and behave as if they were human beings, as if they were living in human societies, and are punished or rewarded for their actions. They show human weakness, such as greed, cruelty, ambition, but also kindness, compassion, resourcefulness. And quite often what we see, cunning, wit, and ingenuity are what are prized. And so they're very well-developed characters, far more than the king and the philosopher, who sort of maintain a structural use. So they move the story along and they provide coherence, but they're more stock figures rather than actual characters. And this structure of the stories within stories within stories has important thematic and interpretive implications. It means that there's no one narrator or narratorial voice. A multiplicity of voices and perspectives instead prevails. And this means that the morals and the messages are not necessarily fixed or singular, but contingent upon point of view and circumstance. In other words, their position within the narrative. Are they part of the main tale or an intercalated tale? And how does this relationship affect the meaning? This suggests, I believe, that the acquisition of truth and of wisdom is an open-ended struggle. the tales also entail recognition that certain moral values, such as the ones I mentioned, like prudence, are not applicable on a general level, but rather have to be applied in very practical, specific circumstances. One critic has stated, one critic has stated that Kalila wa-Dimna is more than just a book of parables or mirror for princes. It symbolizes man's search for truth and justice, challenging his perception of reality on the one hand and the extent of his imagination on the other. The underlying theme of the work is that all creatures, big or small, are part of a creation, and each society is a microcosm of a much larger entity that controls the destiny of its members. So I'm going to come back to these ideas in a bit because I think they're pretty important, and I'll talk about why a bit later on. But first I want to go back to the work and its transmission and its history and talk a little bit about the journeys that it went on, and this is particularly what interests me as a researcher. So the origins of Kalila and Dimna are shrouded in layers of storytelling, as probably befits a work like this with its very different layers of storytelling. And they mix fact and fiction. And this history, these origins, can be reconstructed from various later translations and the introductions that were added to them. But the situation is complicated by the fact that there are often different versions of the introductions, even within the one linguistic tradition, such as the Arabic, and that different names are used for particular individuals that are associated with the history of the work. So it's quite a complex text to unravel in its history. And you can see this by the map, which I hope is distinguishable for you on the screen, which gives an example of the journeys that the book went on from its origins in India, which as I'll discuss now. So about half of Kalila's content originates from an Indian work that corresponds to a 4th century book written in Sanskrit, known as the Panchatantra, meaning 5 chapters or treatises. And this was connected with Brahmanism and Buddhism and is likely derived from oral folk tales. And these 5 chapters dealt with specific themes, some of which are which I'll talk about in a bit, which are prevalent and expanded on in later translations. And these are losing friends, gaining friends, the need for cunning in warfare, loss of gains, and ill-considered action. And the title of the work that we know at Kalila and Dimna comes from the names of 2 jackals who were known in the Indian as Karataka and Damanaka, who are the primary characters of the 1st chapter. So the work was translated in the 6th century after its origins in the 4th. It was translated into Middle Persian and brought to Iran in about 570. And this version is unfortunately now lost and only known to us by later translations such as the Arabic. And the Middle Persian expanded the Indian text to include other fables from different Indian works and included a couple of introductions, one of which I will talk about later. And then from Persian in the 6th century, it was then translated into Arabic in the 8th by a convert to Islam called Abdallah ibn al-Mughaffa, who was a diplomat and a court minister of the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur, to whom the book is dedicated. And this dedication to al-Mansur was not uncommon in the history of medieval literature, and particularly of Kalila wa-Dimna. Manuscripts were expensive to produce, often required the financing of a patron. But more than this, it shows how highly political books were in this period, that they were a means of pleasing a patron or asking for support or establishing influence. And I'm also going to come back to talk about this as well slightly later. I mentioned that al-Mughaffa was a diplomat. Well, he met not a very nice end and ended up being executed for heresy less than a decade after this text was produced. Although to my knowledge, the production of Kalila wa-Dimna itself had nothing to do with his death. Like the Persian translator, he also added and removed chapters and sort of restructured it. And by the time it comes to us in the form of Kalila wa-Dimna, it's now far longer. It's about 18 chapters long, and it's lost some of the qualities that would be associated with Hindu or Brahmin literature. And it tends to as well provide areas of clear moral guidance in instances where the text in the Sanskrit is left far open to interpretation. And like the Persian translator, he also adds his own introduction that explains the aims of the work and the reasons why it should be and how it should be read. And so by the time we reach, by the time the years after Al-Mukaffa's translation, a rich illustrative and manuscript tradition has evolved around the work, and we can tell from the manuscripts that it was very highly prized. As I said, manuscripts were quite expensive to produce, and the fact that these had such beautiful illustrations and that they were so richly decorated suggests that a lot of money had gone into them, and that as a work it was prized by the societies and the cultures for which it was translated. And these are examples from Syrian, Persian and Arabic manuscripts. And it's through Al-Mukaffa's translation that the fables were basically popularized and disseminated. And with the exception of Chinese and Tibetan translations, all subsequent versions descend from this. So the Calila that we know today essentially comes from the Arabic Calila of the 8th century. And its transmission is so wide-ranging and convoluted that I, as one scholar alone, cannot do that justice. And so my focus, given my background and my training, is on the Western branch, particularly the Spanish, the Italian, and the English translations. Although as they reach Western Europe, this takes them on a very non-linear, convoluted journey through Baghdad, Damascus, through Turkey, before it even reaches the Iberian Peninsula. And so my work does extend back and looks back into these histories and these relationships. But as I said, my focus is on Iberia and or Spain, and it was essentially a gateway. You know, medieval Iberia, as I've explained, was highly important in the cultural production of the pre-modern periods, and it acted as a gateway into Europe for this work. And there are two particular translations made in the 13th century that will lead to other translations. There were two Hebrew translations and one into Old Spanish, into Castilian. And from one of the Hebrew translations, a Latin translation is also produced in the 13th century. And so the 13th century was a really important point of dissemination. It's like a whole flurry of activity of translation and cultural exchange taking place. And from the Hebrew and the Latin that's produced, the work then enters into other European vernaculars such as German and Italian and French, and again into Spanish. And so Spain is a country or a region, a peninsula, the work consistently returns to and is translated there. And between the 13th and the 17th centuries, it's translated 3 times in Spain, which is it was far higher than any other language before the 17th century. And I want to, so that's the history of the work, and I want to return to this quote that I started with by Ezen Attil about how the work symbolizes man's search for truth and justice, challenges his perception of reality on the one hand and the extent of his imagination on the other, and that all creatures, big or small, are part of creation, which is what Akin is stating. And I think this quote is helpful and picks up on some, as I see them, important themes in the work, which is firstly the acquisition of knowledge and of wisdom and of truth, often conceived through the motif of a quest for a journey, or a quest or a journey, and related to ideas of power. And secondly, about the idea in the way in which we perceive the world and reality. And thirdly, about how to create community and live together in difference. And I'd like to just think about these a little bit more in turn. So in terms of the search for knowledge and truth, this is very much represented by a motif of the journey or the quest that has no end. And this is explored metafictionally through the structure of the work itself. And so, as I mentioned, there's a series of tales within tales within tales, which means that the text is episodic and cumulative, and that it lacks a strong sense of closure. So after finding their way through the labyrinth of tales, readers emerge wiser and more prepared for the labyrinth of life, whose only certain exit is death. And therefore the work takes them on a sort of ontological journey of self-discovery and also discovering how they work and fit in society. There are, as I mentioned, there are multiple viewpoints, and this is due to the fact that there are multiple narrators. This means that the abstract absolute truth stands in tension with contingent circumstance. In this world, different kinds of truth coexist depending on the particular story or the position of the story in the tale. And therefore, while it may be necessary in some circumstances to use power, force, coercion, and manipulation, in others these coexist with the necessity of prudence, benign governance, and dialogue. So you can see this is about a very practical vision of the world and engaging with others. And this notion of the quest for knowledge or the journey for knowledge is also explored allegorically in the prologues to the earliest Middle Persian translation. And this prologue is essentially describing the translator's journey to India, and it's an allegorical tale which tells the story about the need to seek and acquire something that that his own culture and society doesn't currently possess. By going outside of the boundaries of his known world, essentially, and traveling elsewhere. And there are similarities here with other quest stories where a person may journey to a foreign, often exotic and faraway land to find something such as a holy object or medicine, or in this case, herbs. And so the story, I actually have some handouts here which contain the story. Would you be able to hand them out? Because I don't think you'll be able to read that. Sorry, Kamal, can I keep hold of one? Yeah, thanks. I don't think there's enough. Are you able to read that on the screen? No? Okay. Well, hopefully, I've done 20 copies, so some of you may need to share. I wasn't sure. Basically, the tale of this story is that there is a king in Persia, and he has a physician in his court. He's a very well-respected physician, and he would have been a philosopher as well as a medic. And at the time, the physician tells the king that he had found in certain wise or knowledgeable books mention of a land in India where there are mountains on which grow shrubs and different kinds of plants, that when these are gathered and blended and medicine is extracted from them, that essentially they bring the dead back to life. And so the physician goes to the king and tells the king that I've found this medicine to bring people back to life. And he gets permission from the king to go off on a journey to this faraway land, to India, to go and discover this medicine. And he, according to the introduction, the Persian introduction of the tale, the physician, whose name is Burzoi, sets off for India and spends about 12 months a year gathering the shrubs and plants which grow on the mountain, mixing them as the medicines describe in the books, and trying very diligently to get them to work. And he's watched by local sages and philosophers as he's doing this. And so he complains, and they watch his progress and see that he's getting nowhere, and he complains to them that he's getting nowhere, and eventually they inform him, and this is what for those of you that don't have it, they inform him that that what he had found in the books, they too had found confirmed in their books, and that they had taken an interest in the matter and looked into it for a considerable length of time until they've found something like an interpretation of it in the special books of their wisdom. Namely, and this is the allegorical tale, these mountains are the sages and the scholars of this particular land, India. Those shrubs and plants which are the wisdom which God has caused to be implanted in their hearts, The medicines which were described are the books of counsel and the books of learning, and the dead who are brought back to life with these medicines are the ignorant among men who have no knowledge. But when they are treated with knowledge and made to understand things, and when they make things easy by learning from these books which owe their existence to these scholars, then it is not long until they know and see. So this allegorical tale is essentially telling the sage that what we have here in this land, represented by the medicine, is wisdom, is knowledge. The idea of being brought back to life is an idea of having one's eyes open, having one's mind open to understanding. But what I find interesting about the books, about this tale, not only is it the fact that Berzoi has to go elsewhere, he has to traverse the boundaries of his own society and own culture to find this knowledge and this wisdom and to bring it back to his own in order to make use of it, which I think speaks a lot to the history of this very text. Later on in the prologue here, when he talks about how the book is received, he writes down all of the wisdom and brings it back to Persia, to his own king, to great acclaim. And then the king essentially orders it to be read out, but the book is then placed in the treasury. And so the book is not held to be an object that just anybody can access and anybody can use. It has to be mediated by the king himself, essentially. Placing this book within the treasury signifies that it's of great value, but signifies it's something that this knowledge is not something that everybody can have access to. And I think there's interesting things that can be thought about through this allegory, I always struggle with that word, such as the relationship between power and knowledge, who produces it and who has access to it. And this is also a conversation that I see in the history of the work itself when it's moving across the world. And so this, moving on to a different way of thinking about this, this acquisition of knowledge and the search for knowledge and truth through the motif of the journey. As I've said, I think it's manifested in the global transmission of the text, which brings into play these issues of power and knowledge. And actually the transmission of the work can be seen as an example of translatio studiet imperi, in other words, the transfer of knowledge, but also the transfer of power from one society and culture to another. So this is then more than a book about storytelling. For me, this is a tale of intercultural encounters. And there are two critics I work with that I think have quite helpful quotations, which you can see here. One has described Kalila and Dimna as a remarkable document of the history of contacts between civilizations. And another has remarked that it illuminates the historical layering underpinning cultural production in the quote-unquote European Middle Ages. So the transmission history of this work narrates a story about intercultural encounters across time and space. And it creates a second narrative that surrounds and frames the actual narrative of the fables. For each new translation, each new adaptation often adds introductions, prologues, dedications, rationales for why the work is important for their particular time and their particular place. In other words, reframing the work again and again and again. So this layering of the text and this structure continues in the sort of surrounding material that we have that talks about its history and its origins. So Kalila wa-Dimna is a fascinating, for me anyway, fascinating example of how cultures and concepts travel. They are not fixed or static, but fluid and in perpetual motion. And most importantly, that they do not come into being in a vacuum, but rather through contact and exchange across time, place, language, religions, and between different groups of people. And this is what I was trying to show with the allegorical tale of Berzoi to India. Most importantly for me as a scholar of European medieval and early modern history and literary history, this book reveals the debt that is owed to European cultures and societies to non-Europeans such as Arabic, Hebrew, Turkish, Indian, Persian. Boccaccio, Chaucer, Juan Manuel, Jean de La Fontaine, these authors read and were influenced by and used aspects of Kalila wa-Dimna in their own. And it contributed very much to the development of prose fiction in vernacular like the Romance languages of Europe at this time. And so essentially, European culture and literature wouldn't be what it is today without the interactions with works like Kalila wa-Dimna. And so I think that its transmission creates a commentary on these sorts of relations and on the translation of knowledge and power. And it provides a case study not only in how cultures move and evolve, but how relationships between people and places and religions and societies are perceived. And my research looks into these perceptions, as I've said, in the Western European tradition of the work in Spain, Italy, and England. And scholars have talked about their I think I've missed a bit. Scholars have talked about the text having a universal appeal, but does that mean that it has a universal significance? Can we say that reading it now in the 21st century in Britain, that it held the same meanings as it did in, say, 6th century Persia or 8th century Baghdad or 16th century Venice? I think, hopefully, as you can tell by my rhetorical question, the answer is no. And this is what my work thinks about. So what does the transmission of Calila tell us about these sorts of relationships and how they're perceived? And the way I go about it is I not only look at how particular tales transform and change as they're, translated across the world, but how they are presented to their readers, how they're explained, what the books look like, which is really important. I showed you the beautiful images of the illustrated manuscripts, how that imagery changes and what that might suggest. And the sorts of even marginal notes, sorts of readers. We have examples of manuscripts where readers have commentated in the margins on the text, and that's always really helpful for literary historians such as myself. And so I want to go through a little, a very potted history of the European reception of it that I've been looking at. And I'm going to be looking at 13th century Castile, and then I'm going to move on to Italy and England in the 16th century, and then come very briefly back to Spain again in the 17th century. And I'm going to be focusing on the way that the books looked, on the visuals, to give you an indication of how meanings might have changed, or how the work might have been appreciated differently, or how it might have been Europeanized or brought into the canon of European literature at the time. So this is a couple of examples. The manuscript on the left is an Arabic manuscript from the 14th century, and the one on the right is a manuscript of the Old Spanish translation of Kalila and Dimna. And you can see that the images look very similar. And I think it's clear that whoever was creating the illustrations for this copy had in front of them, or had been exposed to, or had read and seen an Arabic manuscript, because I think there are clear similarities between the way that the animals in these pictures are drawn. What's interesting, although the translation is from the 13th century, this manuscript on the right is from the 15th century, so it's 200 years older than the translation. Now, the translation itself is very, 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 very similar to the Arabic. It's almost a literal rendering of the Arabic into Spanish. And in a part of the paratextual material, the rubric's called a colophon, where we find the date often described, or the name of the person who was the patron or who supported it, and descriptions of what language it was done into and out of. We get the name of a king, Alfonso X, who was known for being a scholar king, who was known for appropriating and translating Arabic works of science, medicine, literature, you name it, into Castilian. But what's interesting for me anyway is that in this colophon, he and the translator or the scribe talk about this work as if it's an Arabic text. And so they don't mention at this point that it's been translated into Spanish. They're still referencing Arabic. And I personally think that even 200 years later, the scribe and the illustrator are making a clear reference to the fact that there is a close link between the Arabic, between the culture, here visual, of Kalila, Dimna, and Alfonso's desire, Spain's desire to own the work, to possess it. Here are a couple more examples I should have shown. Again, on the left is the Arabic, and on the right is the Old Spanish. If we move to the 15th century Spanish, which was done from the Latin, it looks very different, and that's also partly because it's a later translation. But interestingly, this particular translation was probably done more or less about 50 years, around 50 years later than the manuscripts that you've just seen. But it places the text into a very, very different visual and cultural environment. And so the imagery on this particular translation, called the Exemplario contra los engaños y peligros del mundo, an exemplar of how to not fall foul of the traps and the dangers of the world, which is what the title means. Its reference point is a Latin culture. So the imagery there is Latinate. It stems from Germany. It stems from Northern European Christian way of decorating books. And given that this was a very short, relatively short period around the same time when the 15th century manuscript was produced, I do find it interesting that there's such visual differences here. Another difference is that the work was moralized in that it was Christianized. There are clear attempts to create relationships with scripture, with Christian scripture. There are the notes in the margins there are added probably by the printer or the editor, and they might reference parts of the Bible or other aspects of literature that the editor feels is relevant here. And so there's an attempt to bring the text out of the Islamic, out of the Arabic cultural milieu and into the Christian. Which itself is not uncommon, because the Persian and the Persian and Arabic translators themselves removed aspects of the Brahmin and the Buddhist theology that they simply didn't find worked within the realms of Islam. If we jump to the 16th century and into a completely different area of Europe, into Italy and England. These are two on the left, is the Italian translation. And on the right, these are images taken from the English translation. And what we have here is a sort of even greater remove from the Arabic cultural milieu of the work itself. And the reference points, again, are classical. They're Greco-Roman in the imagery. And we find as well that the English translation, which was done from the Italian, doesn't reference really, it doesn't reference the Eastern past of the work. It acknowledges it, but the most impactful reference point is Italy. And so for the translator of the English work, this was an Italian text. And the authority, the cultural authority, came from the fact that it was an Italian text rather than it being a work from the East. And in the dedication by the translator and in a poem to the reader, again, this is emphasized by the editor and the translator. And so he talks about it being, one amongst a number of Italian authors that he has read, amongst which this is the best example of work. And again, the poem describes how this work brings Italy into England. And so there's a real distancing by the time we get to the 16th century reception of it, there's a distancing here from its origins. If we then jump to the 17th century Spanish, I'm taking you on a whirlwind tour of the work's reception. On the left-hand side is the 16th century Turkish source. So this was, the 17th century Spanish was done from a Turkish version, which tells us something about the world, the way that the world was changing, and the relationships that Spain, the cultural relationships that Spain was having in the 17th century were with the Ottoman Empire. So this speaks of different sorts of political relationships than earlier in the centuries. And on the left we have the Humayun Name, which is the Turkish version, and on the right we have the 17th century Spanish. And so it looks like an early modern, a fairly boring early modern text. There's no imagery in it at all. And so what's of interest in this version is, again, the use of marginal annotation to essentially to reclaim space around the text in which to put, or which the editor or the translator could put their own frame on it, to put their own spin, to create relationships between the literature of Northern and Western Europe. And here the sorts of references are scriptural. They're to Genesis, to Corinthians, but also really interestingly to an early English medieval book, which came completely out of the blue to me. I have no idea why he's referencing an early English history of England, which is something I'd like to investigate. But again, there's a shift in emphasis and a shift in the way that the work is seen and appreciated and reclaimed within the space of European literary traditions. So what we find as well in the way that the work is talked about, in the old Spanish version taken directly from the Arabic, that had this very close link at the time in the 13th century between Al-Andalus and between the king at the time, Alfonso, who made the connection. And he saw Al-Andalus as a very potent cultural superior. And the work is taken completely at face value, other than the reference to it being an Arabic text. There's no real judgment of it or no explanation. It's almost as if he saw in it something that needed no qualification and no explanation, because it spoke to the cultural milieu of Castile, of northern Christian territories at the time, that were indebted and looked down to Al-Andalus as a cultural superior. And then as we move into the 16th and 17th century, the work is increasingly orientalized and exoticized. And so I think that with this temporal and spatial distance, we also find it's almost as if it's othered, that the fact that it's no longer simply an everyday work that is similar in tone and perhaps world outlook as it was in Castile in the 13th century, but in the 16th and 17th century Europe, it was seen far more as an exotic jewel of the East. And I think that's because that there was distance in terms of the relationships between Northern Europe at this time and the Ottoman Empire and the lands of the Middle East. And so this was to give you an indication of the reception of the work and how I've interpreted it and how I see it fitting into European discussions about literature and culture. But one thing that really interests me as well is, well, why is it relevant today? Why does Kalila wa-Dimna matter now in the 21st century in Britain? And I would love to hear your thoughts about it, if you have any. I have my own take on it, if you'll allow me. Have I got more time? So this was a text that was aimed at the government, it was aimed at the court, it was aimed at educated, noble people, but it obviously, given its popularity, had a far broader readership and audience and reached people of different social and cultural levels. And I think it matters, as I've said already, it provides a real kick up the butt for people that work on European literature in the Middle Ages to say, look, we have to look at where the influences came from. We have to recognize that European literature owes a debt to Arabic literature, to Turkish literature, to Hebrew, to Persian. And for me, it also provides a historical perspective on what our world is like now, and on the sorts of interconnections that exist between the worlds, and on issues that I foresee as being still highly relevant and affecting modern society, such as how do you function in society? How do you create a civic society? How do you navigate it? How do you interpret people? But I think more importantly for Britain today, how do you recognize and live within difference? How do you live amongst people that are not like you? And this is something that the text, that the fables themselves address in quite a few instances. You know, how do you form communities? And I think that the book's engagement with these issues is, in today's global movement of people, I think it's highly relevant still, and I think it has a lot to say to us as a society in Britain. And these will be different things. The way that we will read it and think about it today will be very different to the way that the rulers and princes of a Sasanian court in the 7th century thought about it. But I still think that it matters. And I think that it matters as well to a city like London, which also has, like medieval Iberia did, a rich mix of cultures and languages and religions. And that perhaps the history and the theme of Kalila wa-Dimna could be a metaphor for London, which, like medieval Iberia, was a meeting place for people, for goods, for ideas, and for beliefs, and for different practices. I have given you on the other end, the other side of the handout, an excerpt from one of the tales that I've been working on quite a bit recently, called The Tale of the Four Friends. And here's just a couple more very pretty pictures of the manuscripts to show you illustrations from it. And The Tale of the Four Friends is essentially about, it's about friendship, as you can probably guess from the title. And it's about how you can create alliances and coexistence between groups of people that on the surface look different, you know, and that can happen if you work together in the face of adversity, is essentially the moral of this tale. And it concerns four friends, a mouse, or in some versions a rat, a deer, a turtle, and a crow. Sorry, I have memory loss there. And these are all animals that by themselves appear vulnerable, and appear like they're, you know, perhaps not the winners in society. But the moral of the story is, as I said, that by working together, they find a way of building community, and they find a way of finding safety and finding peace. And to do so, what I find really interesting about this chapter is that they do so through the medium of storytelling and through the medium of communication. And it's interesting that in this tale, whenever characters meet, they ask each other questions and they tell each other tales. And it's quite explicit about that when they are forming their community, which is often described in relation to a landscape that is peaceful, you know, surrounded by flowers or trees, sort of signaling this utopic space, that they create these bonds by telling each other stories. And whenever I've been thinking about this, these are the sorts of terms and words and concepts that I've been thinking about and engaging with. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about the tale, about this excerpt, and about what your reactions to or thoughts about Calila are as readers in 21st century Britain. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. Any questions from any?
Thank you very much for your called Medieval Lecture. It was interesting. I want to ask you a question. You know, during the time of Panchanatra,
Yeah.
so I don't know the pronunciation, at the same time, Egyptology, Egyptian had a civilization too. And a lot of Egyptology also involves animals. Now, what I like to know, who had more influence on the European side regarding the animals in the mythologies? The Panchanatra or the North African effect? Leading to my second question, how much of Greek mythology involves Panchanatra?
In the Panchatantra,
Panchanatra.
I'm not sure I could give a well-formed, informative answer to either of those questions, I'm afraid, as it's slightly outside of the scope of my research area and knowledge.
Okay, then in that case, just final
Yeah.
question. Tell me yes or no, if I'm right or wrong. In other words, Kalila wa-Dimna was used by Europeans to understand how the rulers of the East, who had such big empires of variety of people they could rule over, and they wanted to learn how to subjugate their variety of people. And this was a book where they had the standards of, you know, human values, justice, etc., etc. Wrong or right? I don't know.
I have remembered something that a translation, a version of the fables, I can't remember in which language, was given to members of the Indian civil service to read as part of the literature for preparing them to going over to colonial India. So you might not be wrong, but I think certainly in, say, pre-17th century, it wasn't so much about learning about the other and therefore how to rule and subjugate, but rather the other way round. What wisdom could be useful for their own time and for their own place. And I didn't mention, but the text is very much associated with this sort of great lineage of scholar kings. And so the king that translated the Old Spanish was clearly trying to position himself within the lineage of Andalusi learning and Andalusi intellectual and cultural heritage, and going even further back to Persia and to India. And we find then, say, certainly later on, by the 16th and 17th century, that you find in the prologues often a history as well that mentions by name, often in very garbled and misunderstood ways, but by name the kings that had themselves either it been dedicated to or had commissioned it or were part of the text history. And so there is a real link between the work and political power, definitely. Yeah. Thank you.
I was interested in your reference to Chaucer, because as a schoolboy we had to grapple with Old English and the Pardoner's Tale, and the story of Chanticleer still remains very vivid in my own mind after so many years. So could you say a bit more about, and if I had known that there was a Muslim world linked to Chaucer, that made it so much more interesting.
Yeah.
You know? And I think it could have a similar impact to the current generation of young people if they were told about these links.
Completely. Yeah, I can't say much more about Chaucer again. I'm sorry, I'm showing the limits of my own knowledge here. I'm not a literary historian of English at all, and I would love to know more about what Chaucer thought of it and how he used it. But what you were saying about it having relevance for today, completely. And I'll give an example that Abdul Karim and I teach a course at King's, and this was the first year that we've taught Kalila wa-Dimna, or rather the Castilian and the Hebrew. I was looking at the Castilian and the Hebrew translations. And we have seminar groups, and in Abdul Karim's seminar group, we had a couple of students who were, I think, very surprised at coming to a degree course in London on Spanish and Portuguese and seeing themselves because they were of Indian, one was her family from India, and she said to me after one of the seminars and to Abdul Karim that she didn't expect to see herself in a degree course of Spanish and Portuguese, and that apparently her whole family got super excited to hear that she had been studying the Panchatantra in her degree course and got really involved, and they were sending WhatsApps about it and encouraging her to write her essay on it, and it really hit home to me as well that there is a need to make those connections for students today. Yeah.
Thank you, Rachel. You know, when I was looking at the transformation of the text, especially the Latinized versions with the side notes from essentially Christian morality and so on, does that coincide with the Crusades at all in terms of timelines?
Not really. The Crusades, no. The Crusades are a lot earlier. So the text that's moralized is the Latin one of the it's Latin one of the 13th century, but that's still maybe a few years too late. The Exemplario, the Spanish version, has even more instances of it, and that was a 15th century translation. So that would have been far too late for the Crusades in the.
I was just wondering whether that kind of fervor led to this transformation.
I don't think so. It was of a par with the way in which texts such as this that dealt with morals were in general moralized. So the fact that this happened with Kalila and Dimna wasn't a one-off at all. That there was a huge tradition of commentary and glossing in the Middle Ages and in medieval Spain, where you would take a text and expand upon it and discuss it in relation to scripture or in relation to other traditions. And so this isn't a one-off. Yeah.
Can I just follow up that question?
Yeah.
With you talked about how the text essentially was Christianized at that point. What you haven't told us, and you mentioned that this is no different in a sense from how it previously had been taken from a Buddhist and Sanskrit background and turned into a text in Arabic. But you never said how it was Islamized. So in other words, you mentioned about the fact that it's Arabic and that it came from an Islamic culture.
Yeah.
But you've never said how the values which you put in a term, which is very problematic, which is secular values. But these texts function within an Islamic culture. They circulated within an Islamic culture. They were supposed to inform the ruler's actions with principles of justice, one of the fundamental Islamic principles, of friendship, trust, all these things. So what you haven't said anything about is that the Islamic dimension, if at all, was present in the tale.
Partly because I don't know enough about it to go into great length. I know that in the Panchatantra, so one thing that I've read that Al-Mukafa does is remove references to, say, reincarnation. He removes references to the caste system that would have related to the Indian social context. He removes references to the asceticism that the work in the Indian, in the Panchatantra displays. And otherwise, one concrete example would be that he adds an entire chapter that deals with the punishment of and provides justice for one of the primary characters and the titular characters for Dimna, which is, and Dimna, Kalila and Dimna were jackals who were ministers of the Lion King, and Dimna essentially causes a rupture between the Lion King and his other ministers, one other particular minister, in order to gain advancement. And it ends up by leading to the death of this friend of the lion who he causes a rupture between. And in the Indian, in the Panchatantra, it's left completely open, and Dimna goes without any punishment or justice. And the tale ends, he dies, and that's it. There's no censure, there's no judgment. And Al-Mukaffa writes a whole chapter dealing, it's called The Trial of Dimna, in which his sins and his misdeeds are expanded upon and explained, and he ends up being executed for the crimes that he's committed. And that's one instance in which a very clear moral guidance and ending is given to an otherwise open to interpretation and unpunished character. But beyond that, I'm afraid I can't say much more.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for the talk tonight. It was so interesting. You mentioned that some of the manuscripts on which the books were translated or based on have been lost now. But can you tell us a little bit about any of the remaining manuscripts? Are they located in Middle Eastern or Arab countries, or have they found their way into European libraries and countries?
Yeah, there are many different Arabic manuscripts. Mm-hmm. None surviving from the 8th century when it was translated. But the earliest ones come from the 12th century. 1221 in the Gregorian calendar is the earliest surviving manuscript of an Arabic translation. The problem with the Arabic is each of the manuscripts show very many variances and differences, and so it's very hard to get to the heart of scholars. Literary scholars, medievalists are obsessed with trying to recreate an original, and it's very hard to do so because there are so many divergences. However, to answer the second part of your question, yes, there are examples and copies of Arabic manuscripts going back to the 13th and 14th century here in the UK, in the Bodleian and in the British Library, Paris, and so there are countless witnesses to the text in European libraries. I don't know when they arrived or how they arrived there, or because of whom, but they do exist there, and so it is very easy for scholars to have access to them here in the UK.
Sorry, in the Spanish version that or the versions that you are looking at, do you find, I know you mentioned about the influences, that the Western influences would be there, but do we see anything which is coming where you can physically show that certain parts of it are coming from particular texts, Western texts, and how they have come about here? And have they then gone ahead in Iberia? Did they influence the Arabic aspects of it or not? Is there a cross-cultural?
No, not as far as I'm aware. By this point, it was a very, very well-established text within the Arabic literary world, and I don't know of any sort of influences going the other way in terms of Kalila and Dimna. Were you asking, do we know what parts of the text, say, or European authors used? Sorry, was
yes,
that your question?
You mentioned that obviously there are other influences taking place, but can we actually find where they're coming from, or it's not so clear?
The other influences on the European
versions of it, the Spanish version.
I see. Yes, no, it is clear, and so for example, the Italian translation in the 16th century was done within an academic society called the Accademia Pellegrina, I think, which had very famous authors and artists, and this was espoused sort of Renaissance humanist ideals of Renaissance humanism. And so the artists. The artwork included in the 16th century references the sorts of Greco-Roman artwork that people like Titian were creating at the time. And so visually the link is there with that style of art that was being produced in Italy in the 16th century. Was that the sort of thing you were asking?
And
yeah.
I mean, that would be the artistic aspect of it,
Yeah.
but what about the literary aspects of it?
It's, I mean, it's still very much a translation of Kalila Dimna, sorry. Oh, I see. Yes, no, we can. I'm sorry, I completely misunderstood your question. No, we can see, in some cases, exactly which fables they've taken. There are examples of them taking a whole fable, a whole tale, and transposing it into their own work. So a Spanish author called Juan Manuel wrote another frame tale inspired by Calila and Dimna called The Count Lucanor, and he uses a couple of fables directly from Calila and Dimna in his own work. Now, I haven't done research on them to see how or where they might differ, but with Boccaccio and with Jean de La Fontaine and with Juan Manuel, we do have specific and precise examples of where exactly in Kalila they've gone to take the material out. Yeah. So that's an avenue that would be interesting to know more about. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think we'll have to end there for now. I'm sure that Rachel Scott's around for questions if there are any afterwards. I don't know. All right, thank you. Please thank her with a round of applause.